Welcome back and thanks for being with us here on Morning Live. Now, while the Basic Education Ministry is today expected to announce the 2021 Matric results, civil society group Equal Education says that the class of 2021 had to grapple with several unique challenges that previous Matric learners did not face. Now, the challenges included power cuts by Eskom and timetable changes due to the local government elections, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the Independent Examinations Board's results were announced yesterday, with that class of 2021 attaining a 98.39% pass rate. Equal Education Head of Research and Development, Roné McFarlane, joins us now to have a further discussion on this. Roné, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina, and good morning to the viewers.
You know, I was just thinking, among all the challenges, one of those that completely slipped my mind was the issue of load shedding and the impact that this had on preparations for the matriculants. But you, of course, as Equal Education, also say that this class was, in fact, more negatively affected by the pandemic as well compared to their 2020 peers. So let's please talk about these challenges that they faced.
Yes, so as we know, for the past 2 years, all learners in schools have been affected by the pandemic. Initially, we had extended school closures, and then when schools eventually did reopen, the challenge was that our school buildings couldn't accommodate all learners safely. And so as a result, in the majority of our schools, learners returned on what is called a rotational timetable, which means that they are not attending school every day. So while in 2020, the government did everything possible to protect the school time of matriculants of 2020, in the same year, grade 11s missed huge amounts of school time, more than half of their school time in 2020. And all of us who've been through the education system knows how much of the work you do in grade 11 actually prepares you eventually for your matric. And obviously it's also the building blocks for grade 12. So as a result, when those learners went back to school this year to face their matric year, there were all these catch-up programs needed to bring them up to speed. We've heard from our members how many of them ended up in Saturday classes, evening classes, or late afternoon classes to try and catch up with what's been missed. And so the pressure on those learners have been tremendous as a result. And one really feels, you've already mentioned all the other stuff, the fact that schools reopened later at the beginning of the year. There was load shedding at times when learners were preparing for their matric exams. And then the the exam timetable changed last minute because of the local government elections. So all of these uncertainties, matric is already a stressful experience for many young people. And if you add all these other unpredictable elements, it really does heighten the pressure on learners who have to write a very important exam.
And often we forget all of this, Roné, when we merely peruse the results and start opining on all of these things. So perhaps worth reflecting on. Also, with regard to the dropout rate, now, this is always, a very contentious topic. But Equal Education, you also say that focus needs to be more at entry level of schooling and observing the rate of students' movement throughout the schooling system at different grades instead of focusing on the throughput rate at the end as we are doing now. So speaking about that, do you have any information that actually monitors the number of learners that enter the system through to matric at any given point in time in the system?
Yes, so Equal Education has for a long time said that it's important to, instead of focusing on the traditional pass rate, which is the pass rate that the minister usually announces, it's usually around 70 or 80%, that instead of looking at that figure, we should be looking at the throughput rate. That is the percentage of grade 2s 10 years ago who end up writing or passing their matric this year. And that gives you a much clearer position of how many learners actually made it all the way through the system. And usually when you do that calculation, you see that the figure is closer to 40 or 50%. And that's really telling us a little bit more of all the learners who enter the system. Only about half of them end up completing their schooling career and passing matric. And that is a massive problem. We see many learners drop out of school on their way to matric. And so therefore the matric pass rate really is only part of the picture.
And that, of course, is a very important indicator. But another one is, as you say, whether or not the pass rate actually improves. This is a poor indicator of the overall health of the basic education system. What would a healthy indicator be?
Yes, so even as we look at the matric results, as I just said, there are better indicators to look at than just the traditional pass rate. We can look at, for instance, how more rural provinces are performing. We can consider the throughput rate that I just explained. We can look at the bachelor pass rate, so how many learners are actually qualifying to go to universities. Those are all already help give us a more nuanced picture. But ultimately, you know, it's important for us to realize that this is really, the matric results are really kind of the tip of the iceberg. And there are many other grades where important learning is taking place, and that when we focus on the matric results, we're not really talking about, you know, what is happening in our early grades. And from some of the international studies that's been done on, for instance, reading in the early grades, we know that, you know, around 70 to 80% of learners in grade 4 can't read for meaning. So in other words, can't understand what they are reading. And that really is a massive crisis. Ultimately, if the foundation isn't strong, that builds up as learners move through their schooling career and ultimately contributes to this huge dropout figure that I was talking about earlier. So while the matric results are important, the moment of the matric results release really gives us an opportunity to reflect on the system more broadly, rather than just what's happening in matric.
And just a final one with regard to budget allocations, Roné. The budget allocation for the sector you've always raised as a concern, recalling how former Finance Minister Tito Mboweni announced a reduction of 9 billion rand. How does Equal Education reconcile this normally big budget? Because in South Africa, we do actually give a large slice of our overall budget to education. Save last year, what are your views, despite the astronomical share that education does enjoy, what is the output that the system actually gives?
Yeah, so we've actually, over the past couple of years, for the first time in democratic South Africa, seen that the education budget is reduced in real terms. And that really means that year on year, we're actually allocating less money to education. This year, we saw the Treasury's budget documents actually explicitly mention the consequences of these cuts, including that we won't be able to employ enough teachers, that some school construction projects will have to be paused, and that this will have a direct impact on learning outcomes. So for the Treasury to mention it that explicitly tells us something about the real consequences of those budget cuts. And it's important to remember that really a small part of the budget is available to do things like build new schools, provide scholar transport. And when we cut the budget, that really then means that pot gets even smaller, and learners who qualify for scholar transport, for instance, can't be provided with transport and have to walk extensive distances. It means that some provinces are freezing teacher posts, which means that where there's a teacher vacancy, they actually don't refill that position. And those decisions really have dire consequences for learners. I mean, this is a broader problem. We've seen cuts to social spending across the board, and COVID has obviously exacerbated that. So we saw government slash the education budget amid COVID to reallocate it to other priorities. And that remains a real concern. None of the education interventions that we want to see can happen without budget allocations.
Roné, we out of time, but I just have to quickly ask you, some education stakeholders have predicted a decline in this year's matric results. What are your predictions?
Yeah, I think it's likely that the pressures brought to bear on learners would have affected the results that we see when the minister announces the matric results this year. I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Roné McFarlane, thanks so much for your time. Equal Education Head of Research and Development, Roné McFarlane, discussing the challenges that face the 2021 matric class in conversation with Morning Live ahead of the announcement of the matric results today by Minister of Basic Education, Angie Motshekga.